Politics and the court system tend to be more anti-black than the larger society. Legal justice has come to mean ensuring that blacks don't break the law while forcing them to submit to whites who break the law. Though their population monopolies ensure that whites dominate and rule, racism within the political and legal systems guarantee blacks will rarely win. Thurgood Marshall, by his acts and omissions, was probably the only U.S. Supreme Court justice prejudiced in favor of black people. However, outnumbered 8-1, his legal opinions on the bench had little real impact on race rulings. Now, if we did not understand before the importance of an attorney general that is for all people, and if we did not understand before the importance of Supreme Court justices that are for all people, we are seeing the fallout of it now, right? The recently appointed AG, which I hope that he resigns. With all the scandal that has come out in the last 48 hours, one would think that he would not only recuse himself from certain cases, but that he would simply resign, right? But he had a history of prejudicial rulings concerning civil rights. People tried to warn people about this man before they appointed him. They didn't listen. Coretta Scott King wrote a 10-page letter about this man, Coretta Scott King, warning people about his racial prejudices and bias and how he intends to undo the work of her husband, the late MLK. They looked at it, they read a part of it. I think it was Senator Elizabeth Warren kind of got told to basically sit down and stop reading the letter, right? Before his hearing. They went ahead and they chose him anyway. And the first thing that this man has done is take a known voters' rights case in Texas where it is shown and proven that they were intentionally creating laws that went against black people. All in the court documents, it's shown proof that these people were deliberately writing these laws to make sure black people could not vote in an area. And he decides to withdraw from the case and say, we're not going to challenge what they did. That was his first decision. So again, it does matter who's on the bench. It does matter who's in our Supreme Court. We know that during Obama's administration, the Voting Rights Act was gutted. And when I say gutted, it took out the provisions that made states be responsible to the federal government to make sure that they were not deliberately creating racist voting practices. That actually was removed. So they no longer have to have a checkpoint with the federal government as to what they're doing, which is why we saw some of the things we saw in this past election. All right. So it does matter who is heading up our political and judicial systems. All right. So let's see what else he says here. Michael Lynn, in his book Up From Conservatism, shares a story that illustrates how bias against blacks is institutionalized within the judicial monopoly. William Rehnquist, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, was ordered away from a polling place in Arizona because he was demanding that black voters be forced to prove they could read by reading the Constitution before being allowed to mark their ballots. People, this is unconstitutional. And he was on the Supreme Court. But here he is at a voting booth trying to demand that people read the Constitution and prove that they can read before they go mark their ballots. That's the kind of person we had sitting on the Supreme Court. All right. Rehnquist passed the litmus test supposedly President Reagan, who appointed him along with his racial attitudes, Chief Justice of the highest court in the nation. In this position, his racial bias could inject and infect court decisions throughout the nation. Any counter bias for blacks was nullified with Clarence Thomas' appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court. Consequently, judicial monopolies control the fate of blacks in ways that are rarely beneficial. All right. Whites maintain a monopoly on holding political office whether blacks vote or not. This is why one of the things that people are consistently saying is don't just complain about what you see happening in your community. Get yourself into a place where you qualify to run for the seat that you're complaining about. This is why everybody is talking about 2018, because the majority of those seats that are now being held will be up for re-election. So it's 2017 now. What can you be doing in your community? You can either choose to run yourself and start preparing yourself to run, or you can look out amongst you and choose people to run and financially back them and get a campaign going so that they can run for those seats. Because if you don't, we're going to see more of what we see right now. We're going to see more of people, of politicians, going against the will of their own constituents that voted them in. You're going to see politicians who are doing what the current ones are doing now. They're refusing to hold town hall meetings. They're refusing to go to the town hall meetings to even hear the people that elected them to office. That they should be ashamed, but they're not. And why aren't they ashamed? Because they figure, I've got it in the bag. They figure, hey, you're just going to complain. You're not going to vote me out. You're not going to move and make the steps necessary to remove me from office. Right. They're in already, but 2018, they can be out. And they can be out with not just somebody we just throw in there, right? They can be out with a viable candidate running against them. And so there is enough time to find viable candidates that can run against these people and get them out. I hope y'all are hearing me today. So, a monopoly on the elective and appointment process for public office continues to place white males in control of 99% of all levels of government and legal systems. Like, I don't know, I live right here in what they call the Beltway, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. So I get to see this up close and personal. This is probably the whitest of white Congress we've had in a while. Okay? And so, in other words, if we don't get control of the monopoly that's happening, if we don't have people in there representing the voice of the minority, the marginalized, if you don't have voices in there representing you, you're going to continue to see the same kinds of bad laws, the same kinds of bad policies, the same kinds of things, ignoring the poor and ignoring the marginalized coming out of the White House. All right. Then he says this: whites in position of power and authority have been conditioned by their experiences in American society to protect the status quo and the advantage of their own group's self-interest. And this is unfortunately something that we're seeing, right? We're seeing the self-interest of one group of people in the country be protected while everybody else's rights gets trampled upon. So you have a part of the country that is saying, oh, I love what our president is doing, right? But then you have the other part of our country saying, our president is now trampling on the rights of people. There's total disregard in some cases for human life. There's total disregard for the breakup and the breakdown of families. But on the other hand, those who are being represented by this political structure right now, they're loving it. They're excited about it. They're even talking about 4 more years. But everybody else who is being affected in a negative way because they don't have proper representation that can speak up for them or that will speak up for them is now saying, we have got to do something about this. All right? As we continue on. The majority of whites who do hold positions in the political and judicial systems are descendants of white immigrants themselves, who entered this nation centuries after the ancestors of black Americans. Though their ancestors were not in this country, when blacks were enslaved and segregated, special admission status reserved seats of power for them in the judicial and the political systems. This nation's fundamental democratic values of inalienable rights and principles of fair play have yet to fully apply to black America. There is no credible evidence that whites understand the true nature of racism and its monopolies or are concerned about the negative impact of them on the life chances of blacks. Whiteness as a monopoly is a subconscious construct that promotes aversion to any form of blackness. Whites tend to equate blackness to liberalism. This is true. Whenever I start speaking about politics for some reason, people seem to think that number one, I'm a liberal, or number two, I voted for Hillary Clinton. And I didn't. And I'm not. But in our society, because so many people do vote Democratic, they equate it to what they call liberalism. Now, liberalism isn't all bad, but the way that they see it and the way that they tack that word on, they try to stereotype and put all black people into a same kind of mindset or a same kind of thinking. And so, again, he's talking here now about what happens when you think that everybody in a certain people group is liberal. It has the effect of moving all of the nation's political parties to racial selfishness. Remember again, we talked about how the Republican National Convention, when they decided to create their budget, they allocated what? $0 to the interests of reaching black people. $0. Because in their mind, blacks were already a shoo-in for the Democratic Party, so they didn't need to waste any time or money trying to reach out to them. They stacked the law enforcement and court systems with conservative officers and judges who are predisposed to anti-black feelings. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which was enacted solely for the equal protection of blacks, is now co-opted and used by the political system to maintain dominance. By the virtue of black people's inherited disadvantages through slavery, peonage, and Jim Crow, and whites' inherited life advantages, there is a lock into conflict and competition. These racial conflicts and the accompanying disparities cannot be eliminated by indifference or by accommodation. When black leaders accommodate and compromise, they lose respect and the black masses move no closer to power or wealth. Moreover, whites find it easier to pacify blacks with symbolic rather than substantial political benefits and opportunities. This only further reinforces racial inequities. Two things. Many people saw that in the case of President Obama. He was more of a symbol, he was more of a figurehead of success than actual success and progress for black America. Now that his presidency is over, yes, he did some things. Yes, he moved some policies. But when it came to black America, there was very little policy given to us. There was song, there was dance, there was the first family dressing well. But when it came down to substantial policies to move black America forward, we did not get that. Same thing is happening now. For those of you who have been keeping up with the news of close to 100 HBCU presidents, right? They met with President Trump. They gave a wonderful photo op. But many of those black presidents of the HBCUs are now speaking out about what actually happened in that meeting. Excuse me for raising my voice. So if you're going to go into a meeting with the president, with an administration that is blatantly white supremacist in nature, I'm trying to take my time here. If you're going to go into a meeting and then you come out of that meeting because the president was supposed to sign an executive order for HBCUs, and most of the HBCU presidents went into that meeting expecting him to increase funding for HBCUs. There was no added money to that executive order that he signed. It was words on a paper. There was no promise of additional funding. There was no promise of helping or keeping in place things like the PLUS loan and the Pell Grant and those kinds of things. There was a promise, though, that if you Negroes are not properly spending the money you already have, we're going to reallocate it to somewhere else. That was the promise. If you read between the lines, he was saying that we're going to make sure we're going to move HBCU issues. We're going to move them from the Department of Education and we're going to reshift them to the White House to focus on. And if we find out or we think that you all are not using the funds you already have allocated to HBCUs, yeah, we're going to take what you do have. So there was no added money, or there was no added promise, or there was no added commitment to make sure that HBCUs continue to operate. So all that they got out of that meeting was a symbol. Really, Trump actually got the symbol, right? He got a photo op that he can use in his next run that he already filed for the next 4 years. So what did they get out of the meeting? What did they get out of the meeting? I can tell you now, most of the HBCU presidents that met were very disappointed. They got a 15-minute meet and greet with President Trump. They got a photo op. And then they met with Vice President Pence. Very few of them got an opportunity to speak about their concerns and their needs for their own HBCUs. And when they were allowed to speak, they were given 1 to 2 minutes a time, each to speak. So we've got to stop with the symbolism. We actually need real answers, real policies, and we need a government that's going to be committed to real answers and real policies for Black America. As we close this section, the implication of monopolies. Okay, so again, these are the monopolies that we have looked at that are running our society, American society. We have looked at racial monopolies. We have looked at population monopolies, wealth monopolies, and today we've looked at media and political and judicial monopolies. So what is the implications? The advantages that flow to white society from various monopolies, the visible manifestations of racism, have yet to be weighted and analyzed to determine how they continue to handicap and injure Black Americans in a competitive society. This is a competitive society. White monopolies guarantee white winners as if ordained by the gods. Few see their societal dominance as a persistent and fundamental injustice within American society. Racial monopolies adversely affect the welfare of blacks and further the best interest of the majority society. Within any marketplace, the majority society forces black competitors sometimes out of existence. The country's founders created a flawed social and political structure that only began to take on the appearance of social democracy, and that was only because of the Civil War and Reconstruction and blacks demanding some level of being treated humanely through the Civil Rights Movement. These national events were more symbolic rather than substantive. So, what is the bottom line here? Structural racism and its monopolies have boxed and locked in many blacks. But nothing created or constructed by mankind is perfect. And so, even though many feel boxed and locked in, Black America can compete and in some instances beat a monopoly. And so that's what Claude Anderson is talking about in this book. Yes, you may feel blocked and locked in, but how can you beat this system? How can you beat this monopoly? And so he's talking about looking at 3 possible options that a group might use against tyrannies of majority monopolies. The oppressed group, financially, economically, can do these 3 things. Number 1, they can revolt and engage in civil disobedience that brings about political and economic reform or an entirely new government. Number 2, they can petition government to intervene on its behalf and force a white monopoly to divest itself of some wealth, resources, and power. Number 3, they can construct alternative political and economic systems and monopolies based on its own group advantages within its own communities. So this book, as he says, is actually going to draw heavily on the second and the third option. And with as he says, with carefully planned behavioral changes, blacks can compete and in some instances beat these monopolies. So that's where we're going to stop for today. Next Friday, we're going to talk about the next impediment to actually winning, and that is inappropriate behavior patterns. Inappropriate behavior patterns. All right. Now, tools for tidings. If you're an entrepreneur, I think you're going to enjoy some of these tips today. We're going to look at 2 entrepreneurs, Tony Robbins and Casey Neistat. Tony Robbins, if you have heard of him, go ahead and put some hearts on the screen. Nobody's heard of Tony Robbins? All right. Tony Robbins is the world's most famous, as he coins himself, performance coach. The world's most famous performance coach. I didn't hear about Tony Robbins until last year. I had a couple of friends who have been to his seminars and have been to the one seminar where he has people walking over hot coals or something like that. But he has advised everyone from Bill Clinton and Serena Williams to Leonardo DiCaprio and Oprah. Tony Robbins has consulted or advised international leaders, including Nelson Mandela, Mikhail Gorbachev, Margaret Thatcher, Princess Diana, Mother Teresa, and 3 U.S. presidents. He has also developed and produced 5 award-winning television infomercials that have continuously aired, on average, every 30 minutes, 24 hours a day, somewhere in North America since 1989. So Tony Robbins knows a little bit about performance. A little bit, yeah. So here is something that he was asked. He was basically asked, what is one of his mantras in life? And he said he learned this from Nelson Mandela. When he interviewed Nelson Mandela and he asked him, how did you survive all those years in prison? Nelson Mandela gave him this answer: I didn't survive, I prepared. Now that is just a sermon all in of itself. I didn't survive, I prepared. And the moment I heard that, I went back to what we just read, that for some reason in our country, we think it is okay to applaud black survival. I know that sounds strange. And that's wonderful. It's wonderful that you survived hell as a black person. But, here's my but. Everything should not have to be about surviving black struggle. At some point, right, at some point, we should just want to celebrate because we have thrived, right? Not just because we survived, not just because we went through struggle after struggle after struggle after struggle. It's almost as if in our society, people think that struggle and black is supposed to be synonymous. And I just refuse to believe that. I refuse to believe that. I don't know about anybody else, but I refuse to believe that. So Nelson Mandela says, I didn't survive, I prepared. What was he doing in prison all those years? He was preparing to come out. He was preparing to lead. He was preparing to have a plan. So it's not just about being in a space, right? It's about what you do when you're in that space. We've been talking about Joseph. What was Joseph doing? Joseph from the Bible. What was Joseph doing when he was in those spaces? He was preparing. He was learning new skills. He was honing skills. So it's not just about surviving the event. It's the preparation that you do where you are. So I thought that was very good. Then he asked him the question, is there a quote that guides your life? He says this, life is always happening for us, not to us. I'll say that again. Life is always happening for us, not to us. It is our job to find out where the benefit is, and if we do, then life will be magnificent. Then he said, losers react, leaders anticipate. Losers react, leaders anticipate. What does that mean again? It goes back to preparing. Preparing. Then he says, mastery doesn't come from an infographic. What you know doesn't mean a hill of beans. What do you do consistently? And I think I put up on my page yesterday, I was thinking about how much advice we take from people who are not qualified to advise us. And I was thinking about, you know, God, what are the qualities that I look for in people to advise me in my life? And I thought about, of the people that advise me, these are things that they hold as characteristics consistently. Number one, they're integrous. Number two, they're persistent in their own career and in their own fields. Number three, they're consistent. As he said, what do you consistently do? And number four, they are diligent. They don't quit. They don't stop when the going gets tough. Those are the kind of people that advise me. They have those characteristics. They're integrous. That means they're honest when nobody's looking. They don't cheat people in business. They're persistent. They keep going. They're consistent. Whatever they do, they're doing it all the time, and they're not stopping, and they're diligent. Then he talked about quality questions create a quality life. Quality questions create a quality life. And then he was asked the question, what is the best investment he's ever made? And he said, the investment in myself, the investment in my own education. And I'll read his words, quote, investing in yourself is the most important investment you'll ever make in your life. There's no financial investment that'll ever match it, because if you develop more skill, more ability, and more insight and more capacity, that is what's going to provide economic freedom. It's your skill sets that make that happen. Jim Rohn famously said, if you let your learning lead to knowledge, you become a fool. But if you let your learning lead to action, you become wealthy. So that takes me back to the scripture where it says that many people are ever learning, right? But they never come to the knowledge of the truth. Truth is something that is active. So we don't want to be the people that are ever learning and never putting into action what we learn.